The truth is, Keisha is the reason we never had a child. She is barren and empty.
The baby shower balloons hadn't even touched the ceiling when Jerome grabbed Keisha by the wrist, pulled her to the center of the room, and told 40 guests she was the reason they'd never have a child. He called her barren, empty. Then he opened the door and led a pregnant woman inside, his arm around her waist. "This," he said, "is what a real woman looks like." Keisha didn't flinch. She smiled, because she already knew something about that pregnancy that nobody else in that room did. The living room of Lorraine's townhouse was drowning in pink and cream. Streamers twisted from every ceiling beam. Balloon arches framed the dessert table where cupcakes sat in neat rows beside a 3-tier cake shaped like a baby carriage. 40 guests filled the space. Cousins, church friends, co-workers, neighbors, all gathered to celebrate Lorraine's first baby. Keisha had spent 3 days helping decorate. She'd hand-tied the ribbon on every favor bag. She'd placed a small wrapped gift on the table herself, a porcelain baby rattle, white with a pale blue ribbon. Something delicate and old-fashioned that she'd found at an antique shop downtown. She'd held it in the store for a long time before buying it, turning it over in her fingers, feeling the smooth weight of it. It was the kind of thing you give when you mean it. Jerome arrived late. He walked through the front door smelling like bourbon and confidence. His collar open 1 button too many, his jaw set like a man who'd already made a decision before he walked into the room. Keisha saw him from the dessert table. She didn't move toward him. She watched, the way he scanned the room, the way his eyes didn't land on her first but on the door behind him, like he was waiting for someone else to arrive. He crossed the room in 4 strides, grabbed her wrist, not gently, and pulled her toward the center of the living room, where the opening circle of chairs sat empty. Conversations stopped. Forks paused midway to mouths. Lorraine looked up from opening a gift, her smile freezing halfway. "I got something to say," Jerome announced, loud enough for every corner of the room to hear. He still hadn't let go of Keisha's wrist. "Y'all keep asking me and Keisha when we're having kids. When's the baby coming? When's it our turn?" He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, let me clear that up right now. It ain't happening, and it ain't because of me." He looked directly at Keisha. "This woman right here, barren, empty, can't carry nothing, can't give me nothing. I've been walking around for 3 years pretending like it's going to happen, and I'm done pretending." The room didn't breathe. Lorraine's mother pressed her hand to her chest. A cousin near the window set her plate on the arm of the chair with trembling fingers. 2 women near the kitchen doorway exchanged a look that said they wanted to leave but couldn't move. Keisha's older sister Rochelle started to rise from her chair, her jaw tight, her fists already forming. But Keisha, without looking at her, gave one small shake of her head. Jerome released her wrist. He walked to the front door and opened it wide. And there she was. Tanya, tall, glowing, wearing a fitted olive dress that curved around a belly 6 months round. She walked in like she'd been waiting for her cue, one hand resting on her stomach, the other reaching for Jerome's arm. He put his hand on the small of her back and turned her toward the room. "This," he said, his voice carrying that showman's pride like a man unveiling a trophy, "is what a real woman looks like. This is the woman who's giving me what my wife never could." Tanya smiled. Not at the room, at Keisha. A slow, deliberate smile that started at the corner of her lips and ended with her eyes locking onto Keisha's face like she wanted to memorize the damage. She sat down in the chair Keisha had been using earlier, crossed her legs, and picked up Keisha's glass of lemonade from the side table. She took a sip. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The sip said everything. I'm here now. This is mine. Deidre, Jerome's mother, was sitting near the window. She didn't gasp. She didn't flinch. She reached over and placed her hand on Tanya's shoulder like she was welcoming home a daughter she'd been expecting for months. That single gesture told the room everything it needed to know. Deidre already knew. She'd known the whole time. Every eye in the room swung to Keisha. They waited for the tears, the screaming, the throwing of something breakable. Keisha stood still. She looked at Jerome. She looked at Tanya's belly. She looked at the porcelain rattle sitting on the gift table, still wrapped in its ribbon. The room held its breath so long the balloons seemed to stop swaying. And then she smiled. Not wide, not broken, just a small, quiet curve at the edges of her mouth. The kind of smile that made 3 women in the front row lean back in their chairs because it didn't belong on the face of a woman who'd just been gutted in public. Because Keisha already knew something about that pregnancy that nobody else in that room did. And she was willing to wait. 3 years earlier, Keisha had met Jerome at a community fundraiser on the South Side. He was running a booth for his real estate development company, handing out flyers with both hands and talking like he was running for mayor. He was charming in the way that made you forget to check for substance underneath. Keisha was volunteering at the registration table, quiet and steady, organizing name tags while everyone else socialized. Jerome walked over, leaned on her table, and said, "You the calmest person in this whole building. That either means you're bored or you're dangerous." She laughed. That was the beginning. The first 2 years of the marriage were good. Or at least they looked good from the inside. Jerome talked about children constantly. He'd rub Keisha's stomach after dinner and whisper, "Soon." He bought a crib before they'd even started trying. He painted the spare bedroom a soft yellow and called it the baby's room when friends came over. On their first anniversary, he gave her a pair of tiny knitted booties and said, "Next year, somebody's going to be wearing these." Keisha kept them in the top drawer of her dresser. She checked on them some nights before bed like they were already filled. But when months passed and nothing happened, the warmth started pulling back like a tide that doesn't announce it's leaving. Jerome stopped asking about her cycle. He stopped touching her stomach. The spare bedroom door stayed closed. The booties stayed in the drawer, untouched, and the drawer itself became something Keisha stopped opening. She went to a fertility specialist on her own. Jerome refused to go. He said the problem wasn't on his side. He said going to a clinic would be an insult to who he was. "You questioning my manhood now?" he said one night, his voice rising in the kitchen, his hand flat on the counter so hard the salt shaker wobbled. Keisha didn't argue. She let the silence absorb it. Her results came back normal. Everything was where it should be. The doctor said the next step was testing Jerome. Keisha brought it up once over dinner. Jerome slammed his keys on the table, pushed his chair back, and walked out the front door. He didn't come home until after midnight. She didn't bring it up again, but she started noticing things. His phone face down on the nightstand every single night. Calls taken outside in the driveway with the car door closed. A receipt for a diamond bracelet she never received, folded into the inside pocket of a jacket she was about to take to the cleaners. And his mother, Deidre, slowly pulling away, canceling Sunday dinners with thin excuses, keeping phone conversations to 3 minutes, never quite looking Keisha in the eye when they were in the same room. One evening, while reviewing their shared insurance account online for a billing question at work, Keisha noticed a recurring monthly charge to a private medical clinic she didn't recognize. Not a dentist, not an urgent care, a specialty clinic with a name that didn't explain itself. She screenshotted the charge. She said nothing. She filed it away in a folder on her phone labeled MISC and closed the screen. That folder would grow thicker before the year was out, and the story it would eventually tell would rewrite everything Keisha thought she knew about the man sleeping beside her. 2 weeks after the baby shower, the house was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Jerome was barely home, staying out late, coming back smelling like a different soap, a different perfume, a different life. He didn't bother with excuses anymore. He'd walk past Keisha like she was a lamp he'd stopped noticing. Rochelle came by the apartment twice that week. She paced the kitchen floor, arms folded, fury barely contained. "You need to leave him, Keisha. Tonight. I'll help you pack. I'll drive the car. We can be out of here before he gets back." Keisha was sitting at the table, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't look up. She said 2 words. "Not yet." Rochelle stopped pacing. She stared at her sister. Something in those 2 words made her sit down instead of argue. She didn't understand yet, but she trusted Keisha enough to wait. That Sunday, Jerome left early, said he was meeting Barren, his business partner, about the upcoming investor gala. Keisha watched his car pull out of the driveway from the upstairs window. She waited 20 minutes, counting each one. Then she walked into his home office. She didn't have to search long. Jerome had always been careless when he felt powerful. The desk drawer was unlocked. He hadn't even bothered to turn the key. Inside, beneath a stack of development blueprints and bank statements, she found a manila folder with the logo of the same medical clinic she'd seen on their insurance months ago. She opened it. Inside were printed records, consultation notes, a signed consent form with Jerome's full legal name and signature at the bottom, and a procedure confirmation dated 3 years ago, 4 months before they'd even begun trying for children. Jerome had a vasectomy 3 years ago, before the painted nursery, before the whispered soon, before the tiny knitted booties he'd placed in her hands like a promise, before every doctor visit he refused to attend, before every night he blamed her body for something he'd already made sure was permanent. Keisha's fingers didn't tremble at first. They went still, completely still. The way a body goes still when something rearranges itself at the foundation, and everything built on top of it starts shifting. She lowered herself to the floor of the office, her back against the cold wood of the desk, and held the papers on her lap. She didn't cry. She breathed, 1 long breath in, 1 long breath out. The air tasted different now. Every argument, every whispered prayer, every night she'd lain awake wondering what was wrong with her body. All of it had been a stage play, and she'd been the only one in the audience who didn't know the script. She turned to the next set of documents in the folder, printed text messages. Jerome was careless enough to keep paper copies of things he thought no one would ever find. The thread was between him and his mother, Deidre. The messages were months old, some dating back to before the wedding. One message from Deidre read clear as a headline. "Don't let that girl trap you with a baby before you've made your money. Handle it. Be smart." Jerome's reply, sent 14 minutes later. "Already handled." Keisha read it twice. The double wound landed exactly where it was aimed. Her husband had sterilized himself and built a 3-year performance out of blaming her for the emptiness. And his mother had not only known, she'd held the blueprint. She sat on that floor for 5 full minutes. The house was silent. The clock on the desk ticked. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked. Then something shifted behind her eyes. Not rage, not sorrow. Something colder and more precise. Something that looked a lot like arithmetic. If Jerome had a vasectomy 3 years ago, then whose baby was Tanya carrying? Keisha didn't confront anyone. She photographed every document, the vasectomy records, the consent form, the insurance charges, every single one of Deidre's messages. She returned the folder to the exact position she'd found it, closed the drawer gently enough that the lock didn't click, and walked out of the office. On her way to the bedroom, she passed the hallway shelf where she'd placed the porcelain baby rattle after the shower. It sat there between a framed photo and a stack of mail, catching the afternoon light through the window. She stopped, picked it up, turned it over slowly in her palm, the way she had in the antique shop the first time she'd held it. But the weight felt different now, heavier, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. She placed it in her purse. She zipped it shut. And she walked downstairs like a woman who'd just finished reading the last chapter of a book. Everyone else was still halfway through. The next 6 weeks moved like a woman who'd already made her decision and was simply waiting for the clock to agree with her calendar. Keisha hired a divorce attorney, a woman named Sandra Clark, who worked out of a small firm near the courthouse. Sandra had a reputation for being thorough, quiet, and impossible to surprise. She didn't flinch when Keisha laid the documents on her desk. She looked at the vasectomy records, read Deidre's texts, turned each page over carefully, and said, "We're going to be very precise about this." Keisha pulled Jerome's medical records legally through their shared insurance portal. Everything she needed was already accessible under the joint policy. She confirmed the vasectomy date. She confirmed the clinic. She confirmed the doctor's name. She printed everything twice and drove the copies to Rochelle's apartment, where she locked them in a drawer that only she and her sister had keys to. Then she did something no one expected. She reached out to Byron. Byron was Jerome's business partner, the co-founder of the development company, the man who'd helped Jerome close every major deal for the past 4 years. They'd started the company together in a shared office the size of a closet and built it into something that got invited to galas. Keisha called Byron's cell and asked if they could meet for coffee. Not about Jerome, not about business. Just to talk. Byron agreed, though his voice on the phone carried the stiffness of a man who wasn't sure what kind of conversation he'd just agreed to. They met at a coffee shop near his office. He was nervous. He fidgeted with sugar packets, rearranging them in the holder and then putting them back. Keisha asked light questions about the company, about the upcoming investor gala, about how the new office renovation was coming along. She sipped her coffee and let the conversation breathe. Then she mentioned Tanya, casually, like a passing thought drifting through an easy conversation. "She seems nice. How long has she been coming around Jerome's events?" Byron's face changed. The ease left his eyes. His jaw tightened. He looked at his coffee cup like it had asked him a question he didn't want to answer. "She was with me first," he said quietly, almost to himself. 2 years. We were together 2 full years before she started showing up around Jerome. He paused. His thumb rubbed the rim of the cup. "We ended things about 10 months ago." Keisha did the math in her head without letting a single digit show on her face. 10 months since Byron and Tanya separated. Tanya's belly at the baby shower had been about 6 months along. The conception window sat perfectly inside Byron's timeline, and completely outside the possibility of a man who'd had a vasectomy 3 years prior. She thanked Byron for the coffee. She didn't explain why she'd asked. He didn't ask. But something in the way he looked at her when she stood up told her that somewhere deep beneath the surface, Byron already suspected what she now knew for certain. Keisha walked to her car, sat behind the wheel, and let herself breathe for 30 seconds before starting the engine. She now held 3 weapons in her hands: the vasectomy proof, Deidre's conspiracy in black and white text, and a timeline that pointed the paternity of Tanya's baby directly at the man who'd been fidgeting with sugar packets across from her. Meanwhile, Jerome's confidence swelled like a man standing on ground he didn't know was hollow underneath. He brought Tanya to Sunday dinner at Deidre's house and let her sit in the chair that used to be Keisha's. He posted photos with her on social media, his hand on her belly, captions about new beginnings and God's timing. Comments poured in, hearts and congratulations from people who didn't know the full picture. He told Keisha over breakfast one Tuesday morning, his mouth half full of toast, "You should be grateful I haven't filed yet. I'm giving you time to figure out where you're going to go." Keisha poured his coffee without a word. She set the mug in front of him and walked to the sink. She didn't respond. She didn't have to. The calendar on the inside of her closet door was doing the talking for her. Tanya grew bolder too. She texted Keisha from Jerome's phone one afternoon, a message Keisha saw while washing dishes. "No hard feelings, right? Some women are just built for it." Keisha read it. She dried her hands. She locked the phone and set it face down on the counter. She didn't reply. Some silences carry more weight than a paragraph ever could. That evening, after Jerome left for another night out, Keisha walked to the bedroom closet, opened the door, and looked at the calendar taped to the inside panel. 8 weeks from now. Jerome's Investor Gala, the biggest night of his career. 200 guests. Every partner, every investor, every city official, every person whose handshake kept his empire vertical. Keisha circled the date in red ink. She closed the closet door softly and went to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in months. Something started shifting in the weeks before the gala, and everyone around Keisha felt it, even if they couldn't put a name on it. She dressed differently, not flashy, just precise. Clean lines, fitted shoulders, colors that didn't apologize. She started wearing her hair pulled back in a way that showed her jaw, her posture straight, her eyes steady and unhurried. She stopped filling silence with nervous words. When Jerome walked in the room, she didn't tense. She didn't look away. She just existed next to him, like a woman who'd already finished a conversation he didn't know had started. Jerome noticed. He tested her the way insecure men always test what they can't control, by poking at it. He dropped Tanya's name into dinner conversation. He mentioned the nursery he was setting up at the apartment he'd rented for Tanya across town. He talked about baby names. He described the crib he'd ordered, a nicer one than the one he'd bought for the yellow room. Keisha nodded like he was reading her the weather. She asked if he wanted more rice. He didn't know what to do with that. The anger he could handle, the tears he'd prepared for. But this calm, this unshakable room temperature, nothing touches me calm, made the back of his neck hot. One night he stood in the bedroom doorway, his shoulder against the frame, and stared at her for a long time. "What's wrong with you?" he finally asked. She looked up from her book. "Nothing's wrong, Jerome." He waited for more. There was nothing more to give. He walked away, but he looked back twice before he reached the hallway, and the second time his step slowed, like a man who'd heard a sound he couldn't locate. At a family brunch the following Sunday, Deidre was in rare form. She sat at the head of the table and talked about grandmotherhood with the joy of a woman rehearsing her victory speech in front of a mirror. She mentioned the nursery she was helping Tanya set up. She mentioned the stroller she'd already bought. She mentioned how she'd been praying for a grandchild for years and how God was finally answering. She looked directly at Keisha when she said, "I'm finally getting the grandchild I deserve." Keisha picked up her glass of water. She took a slow sip. She set it down and smiled. Warm, easy, the kind of smile that made the room lean in. "You absolutely deserve what's coming, Deidre." The table went quiet for 3 full seconds. Deidre's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Jerome looked up from his plate, his chewing slowing. Rochelle, sitting at the far end, pressed her lips together so hard they turned white and stared at her napkin. No one asked what Keisha meant, but the words hung in the air like perfume in a closed room, and no one forgot them. Jerome started watching Keisha more carefully after that. He asked questions with edges on them. "Who have you been talking to? What's in that purse you carry everywhere? Why do you look like that?" Keisha answered every question with a softness that gave him absolutely nothing to grip. "No one special. Just my things." "Like what, Jerome?" He couldn't crack it. And that was the thing about control. The moment it starts slipping, the man who built his whole world on it can feel the floor tilting, even if he can't see where the crack begins. Rochelle visited midweek. She sat on the edge of Keisha's bed while Keisha stood by the window, watching the trees shift in the evening wind. "How much longer?" Rochelle asked quietly. Keisha didn't turn around. 8 more days. The gala invitations had been printed on thick cream cardstock with gold embossing. Jerome had been rehearsing his keynote speech in the bathroom mirror every night for a week, adjusting his tone, practicing his pauses, perfecting the moment where he'd gesture toward Tanya and declare his future. It was supposed to be the night that made him untouchable, the night every investor in the city remembered his name. He had no idea that Keisha had already confirmed her attendance through the event coordinator. He had no idea she'd arranged her own seat, last row, near the exit, exactly where she wanted to be. And he had no idea about the thin envelope she kept inside her purse, tucked beside the porcelain baby rattle she'd been carrying for weeks, like a woman carrying 2 halves of a prayer she was about to speak out loud. The ballroom of the Heritage Grand Hotel was built for nights like this one. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings 20 feet above the floor. Round tables draped in ivory linen filled the space like islands. A stage with a glass podium sat at the front beneath a banner that read, "Building Legacies, the Carter Development Group Annual Gala." 200 guests filled the room. Investors in dark suits, contractors with firm handshakes, city officials with practiced smiles, family members dressed in their Sunday best on a Saturday night. Jerome moved through that room like a man who owned every square foot of it. He wore a tailored navy suit and a gold watch Keisha recognized because she'd bought it for their 2nd anniversary. Tanya was beside him in a designer ivory maternity gown that caught the chandelier light when she turned. Jerome introduced her at every table, his hand on her lower back, his voice pitched just loud enough for the neighboring table to hear. "This is Tanya. She's carrying my son." He said it the way a man talks about a building he just closed on, with possession, not love. Deidre sat at the family table near the stage in a plum-colored dress and pearls, her chin high, her posture rehearsed. Barren sat 3 tables away from the stage, his leg bouncing under the tablecloth. He looked at Tanya once when she walked past and looked away fast. Keisha arrived quietly, 15 minutes after the cocktail hour ended. She wore a simple black dress, nothing that begged for attention, everything that commanded it. Low heels, small earrings. She walked in through the side entrance, sat in the last row of tables near the exit and placed her purse on the chair beside her. Inside that purse sat the porcelain rattle and the envelope, both waiting with the same patience Keisha had carried for weeks. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the room fill with laughter and clinking glasses. She didn't approach anyone. She didn't need to. Halfway through dinner, the lights dimmed. A spotlight hit the podium. Jerome took the stage to polite applause that grew louder as he smiled and adjusted the microphone. He gripped the podium with both hands, looked out at the 200 faces watching him, and launched into the keynote he'd been polishing in the bathroom mirror for weeks. He thanked the investors by name. He praised the contractors. He acknowledged the city officials who'd supported his zoning applications. He talked about legacy, about building something that lasts, about foundations. Then he acknowledged his mother. He called her the strongest woman I know. Deidre pressed her hand to her chest and tilted her head in a pose she'd clearly practiced. Then Jerome turned toward Tanya's table. His voice dropped into something softer, something engineered to sound intimate in a room full of microphones. And to the woman who's giving me what I've always wanted, a legacy, a son, a future. Tanya, stand up, baby. Tanya rose like a woman who'd been waiting for that cue her entire life. She placed both hands on her belly and turned toward the room with a smile that covered every table. The crowd applauded. Camera phones lifted. Deidre wiped a tear that may or may not have been real. That's when Keisha stood. She didn't stand fast. She didn't stand angry. She rose from her chair the way a woman rises when she's finished being still, and the time has finally arrived to move. She picked up her purse, pulled the thin envelope from inside, and began walking toward the front of the room. The first few people near the back noticed her and stopped clapping. Then the tables in the middle. The silence spread from the back of the ballroom to the front like a wave, pulling the sound out of the room. By the time Keisha reached the edge of the stage, 200 people had gone quiet. Jerome's smile was still frozen on his face, but his eyes had changed. He saw her. He saw the envelope. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Keisha didn't take the microphone. She didn't need it. The ballroom was designed for voices to carry, and hers, calm, clear, steady as a heartbeat, reached every table. "Jerome," she said, "before you celebrate your legacy, I think everyone in this room should know something." She opened the envelope. She unfolded the first document, the vasectomy procedure confirmation, dated 3 years before this night, and held it steady so the front tables could see the clinic's letterhead. 3 years ago, Jerome had a vasectomy. Before we even started trying for children. Every time he told me to see another doctor. Every time he called me Barren in front of his family. Every time he let his mother sit across from me and suggest something was broken inside me. He already knew the truth. He made sure there would never be a child. And then he blamed me for it. The room did not move. 200 bodies. 200 held breaths. Someone at a far table set down a champagne glass so carefully it didn't make a sound. A woman near the stage covered her mouth with both hands. An investor in the second row looked at his wife, then looked at Jerome, then looked at the floor. Keisha let the silence sit for 5 full seconds. She didn't rush. Silence was her language now, and she spoke it fluently. Then she said the words that emptied the air from every lung in the room. Which means that baby Tanya is carrying isn't his. Tanya's hands dropped from her belly like they'd been burned. Her mouth opened. The glow on her face collapsed into something gray and unfinished. She looked at Jerome. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them denied it. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the building. 3 tables away, Byron dropped his head into both hands. His shoulders curved inward like a man who'd just watched the ground open beneath his chair. His date leaned away from him. She didn't ask if he was all right this time. Deidre stood halfway out of her chair, the legs scraping against the marble floor. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend her son, to redirect the room, to do what she had always done. Keisha turned to face her, and the words in Deidre's throat died before they reached the air. "Sit down, Deidre." Keisha reached into the envelope and pulled out a printed screenshot of the text exchange. She held it up. She read one message aloud, the one that said, "Don't let that girl trap you with a baby before you've made your money. Handle it. Be smart." She looked at Deidre. "You told your son to do this. You knew what he did the day he did it. And you sat across from me every Sunday dinner for 3 years and smiled like the secret wasn't rotting underneath your pearls." Deidre lowered herself back into the chair like a woman whose legs had stopped listening to her brain. No one at her table looked at her. The pearls around her neck caught the chandelier light, and for the first time all evening, they looked cheap. Keisha folded the documents. She placed them on the glass podium gently, right beside Jerome's printed keynote speech. Then she reached into her purse one last time and pulled out the porcelain baby rattle. The same one she'd bought for Lorraine's baby shower. The same one she'd wrapped in a pale blue ribbon, with love she didn't know was being wasted. She set it on the podium with both hands, the way someone places a flower on a grave. "I bought this for a baby that was never going to exist," she said. "Not because of me, because of you." She looked at Jerome one final time. His jaw was slack. His hands gripped the edges of the podium like a man holding onto a building that was already falling. The gold watch on his wrist, the one she'd given him, caught the light, and for one moment it looked like the most expensive thing on a man who'd just lost everything that mattered. "I loved you with everything I had," she said, "and you turned that love into a show. So I'm not here for revenge, Jerome. I'm here because the truth deserved a room this big." She turned. She walked between the tables, past the investors with their open mouths, past the officials pretending to check their phones, past Byron with his face in his hands, and Tanya gripping the edge of her table like the floor was moving. Keisha's heels clicked against the ballroom marble in a rhythm that sounded nothing like running and everything like leaving on her own terms. The double doors closed behind her, and the silence she left in that room weighed more than any speech Jerome Carter would ever give again. The collapse didn't come in one wave. It came in layers, each one pulling something else out from under Jerome's feet until there was nothing left to stand on. Within 48 hours, 3 major investors pulled their commitments from the Carter Development Group. The phone calls didn't come with anger. They came with voicemails that simply said, "We've decided to go in a different direction," which was worse than shouting, because direction meant distance, and distance meant permanent. It wasn't the affair that undid him. Affairs were common enough in that world, and money has always been willing to overlook a wandering eye. It was the vasectomy. It was the architecture of the deception, the years of publicly blaming a woman for something he'd engineered in private, the calculated performance of victimhood while his wife carried the shame he manufactured. That kind of deception made every handshake feel suspicious. And in real estate development, where a man's word backs a $1 million deal, trust is the only currency that actually clears. Byron released a statement to their shared investors within the week, 4 sentences long, saying he was exploring independent ventures. He never publicly confirmed the baby was his. He didn't have to. Every person at that gala had done the math before the dessert plates were cleared, and math doesn't need a press release. Tanya confronted Jerome at his apartment 3 days after the gala. The neighbors heard it through the walls, not Tanya crying, but Tanya shouting. She'd believed him. She'd believed the baby would give her a seat at his table, a ring, a future with his last name on it. She'd walked into that baby shower and sat in Keisha's chair and texted her with confidence because she thought she was holding the winning hand. Now the vasectomy records made her realize she was the last person in every room to understand what had actually been happening. The performance wasn't just for Keisha, it was for Tanya too. Jerome had used them both, just from different angles. She packed a bag that night. Jerome stood in the doorway of the apartment and watched her walk to her car without saying a single word. He didn't chase her. He didn't apologize. He just stood there the way a man stands when he realizes that the audience he'd been performing for has left the theater. Deidre's unraveling was slower, but cut just as deep. The screenshots of her text messages reached her church community within days, forwarded on group chats, whispered about in parking lots, read aloud at kitchen tables across the neighborhood. 2 ministry boards she'd served on for over a decade requested her quiet resignation. Friends who'd sat beside her in those pews for 20 years stopped answering her calls. One of them told the pastor's wife, "I can't worship next to a woman who helped destroy her own daughter-in-law's life and served communion with the same hands." Deidre called Keisha 4 times in 1 week. Keisha never answered. On the 5th call, the number was no longer in service. Deidre drove to the house on a Wednesday afternoon. The locks had been changed. The driveway was empty. A realtor's lockbox hung on the front door handle. The house was already listed. Jerome tried harder than his mother, but with less dignity. He called from different numbers. He sent messages through cousins, through old friends, through people who hadn't spoken to either of them in years. He drove past the house at night, slowing near the curb, his headlights sweeping across the dark windows and the "for sale" sign in the yard. One evening, 9 days after the gala, he parked outside the house he used to own, turned off the engine, and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the front porch. The light was off. The curtains were drawn. The spare bedroom window, the room he'd painted yellow and called the baby's room, was dark. He sat there for 40 minutes. Nobody came to the door. Nobody was inside. Keisha was already 300 miles away and didn't look back once during the drive. The divorce papers arrived at Jerome's apartment the following morning. Sandra Clark's firm had filed them the day after the gala. Jerome read them at his kitchen table, alone, in a wrinkled shirt and yesterday's coffee going cold beside him. The documents were clean, precise, and final. Keisha wasn't asking for the house, the car, or half the company. She was asking for exactly what was legally hers and the freedom to never carry his last name again. He signed them 3 weeks later, not because he wanted to, because there was nothing left to hold on to. 6 months later, a moving truck pulled up to a small brick apartment building in a city 300 miles from the ballroom, the church, the baby shower, and the house with the yellow room that never held a crib. Keisha carried the last box herself. Rochelle had driven down to help unpack. They worked side by side through the afternoon, stacking plates and cabinets, hanging curtains that caught the light, filling a bookshelf Keisha had picked out online during a lunch break at her new job. The apartment was modest: 1 bedroom, a galley kitchen with a window above the sink, and a narrow balcony that looked out over a park with old oak trees and a gravel walking path that looped around a pond. Keisha had taken a senior billing administrator position at a hospital network, a step up from where she'd been, with better hours and a team that called her by her first name on the first day. She got the job on her own resume, her own interview, her own handshake. Nobody in this city knew Jerome. Nobody asked about babies. Nobody whispered when she walked into a room. Every morning, she drank her coffee on that balcony. She watched the joggers loop the path around the pond, watched the light shift through the oak branches as the seasons started to turn, watched the city move at a pace she could finally match without holding her breath. One afternoon in early autumn, a package arrived. The return address was Lorraine's, the cousin who'd hosted the baby shower where everything had started. Keisha set it on the kitchen counter and opened it slowly, peeling back the tape, folding the cardboard flaps. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper so careful it looked like someone had used their Sunday hands, was the porcelain baby rattle. The same one. The one she'd placed on the podium at the Heritage Grand Hotel, beside Jerome's keynote speech, under the chandelier light. A handwritten note was tucked beneath it, written in Lorraine's slanted cursive, "You left this behind, but you didn't leave behind who you are." Keisha held the rattle for a long time. She turned it over in her fingers the way she'd done in the antique shop the very first day she found it, and the way she'd done on the floor of Jerome's office, the day the truth rearranged everything. It was lighter than she remembered, or maybe she was just stronger now. The difference didn't matter anymore. She carried it to the windowsill beside the balcony door, the one that caught the first gold light of every morning before the sun climbed high enough to warm the rest of the room. She set it there, upright, the pale blue ribbon still tied around its neck. She stepped outside onto the balcony. The October breeze moved through her hair. The oak leaves shuffled in shades of copper and rust. Somewhere below, near the edge of the pond, a child laughed, a bright, clear sound that drifted up through the branches like something that had been waiting to arrive. Keisha leaned against the railing, wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, and breathed. Deep, full, the kind of breath that fills a body all the way to the places that used to feel empty. Some women don't respond to humiliation. They outgrow it. They don't argue. They don't collapse. They become patient enough to let the truth arrive on its own. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who understands that kind of strength. And stay close, because the most dangerous women are the ones who don't need to prove anything. Keisha never raised her voice. She raised her standards, and in the end, the only thing truly exposed in that room was not her emptiness, but his.